Thank you all for participating in this course and a warm welcome to this last session. I hope you all have had an opportunity to listen to lectures 1 to 7. If not, you still will have a chance until 6 March to do so. Firstly, a little bit of a recap, and before I do a recap of some of the things that we have done, I wanted to talk a little bit about language. The language that we use when talking about disabilities has varied over time, and there aren't any perfect terminology, at least as yet, on what would be the best terms to use. Firstly, we have done the distinction between physical disability and sensorial disabilities and those living with mental conditions and syndromes. We would like to prefer to use always, you in your profession or with a family member that lives with a condition and so on, to focus on their abilities rather than on their disabilities. And it is challenging what is the terminology to be used. Special Olympics, which is the world's largest organization of persons living with conditions and syndromes, uses the term, until this day, intellectual disabilities as a broad generic term. Obviously, in the past, we have seen very difficult terminology. In the 1950s, the term idiocy was used a lot. In fact, I think I mentioned in an earlier session, when reviewing the legislation in the Dominican Republic, they still used that type of terminology in both the penal code and in civil code. Idiotez, enajenación y locura. Terminology that is extremely demeaning. Now they are changing the terminology, but it is a term that lives through and lives on in some old literature and in the terminology that some people use. Now, in the late 1950s, when they were still using this type of terminology, like idiots, then it became like a step forward using the word retarded. And over the past decade or more, we have been working, quite many of us, at eliminating that type of word, extremely demeaning, and we therefore, rather than use the word, we sometimes say the R word, letter R, the letter R representing this type of term we would not like to use. Now, you might find yourself, if you're in the medical profession, if you're in the nursing profession and so on, I try to use either mental conditions and syndromes to define a specific condition as opposed to other types of conditions. I prefer that to intellectual disability, in part because there are many that still see a condition as a disease, rather than just like I can be born with, you know, missing an arm or something. I live with that type of condition, but obviously when it's physical, we tend to use the term disability. But when talking about conditions such as autism, Down syndrome, the Prader-Willi syndrome, and so on, we obviously need to try to find a terminology that isn't kind of looking down on a person or being negative. Obviously, if you are in psychiatry or psychology, or if you are an occupational therapist, and so on. You will have technical terminology that you will use. But what is the type of terminology that we should use when interacting in a non-professional context, or when interacting with someone that lives with that condition? We want to use terminology that strengthens their self-esteem, that focuses on their special abilities, on what they are much better than other persons, and so on. So again, I cannot give you a perfect type of terminology, but I want each of you to be aware, what type of terminology am I using? Am I using a terminology that is demeaning or so? Or can I find terminology that focuses on the positive rather than on whatever is perceived as being a witness? So terminology is extremely important over time. It will be changing and be part of the change towards terms that are better at describing a positive experience. In Spanish, we have seen increasingly the use of capacidades diferenciadas, different abilities, you could call it. We have seen in some countries in Europe, they use functional variations. Again, there are different types of terms that are being used for wider communication. I'm not now talking about the kind of standard jargon, professional jargon that may be used among professionals. But when interacting with the father or mother of somebody that lives with a condition, think of terminology that lifts up rather than puts down, and that increases the self-esteem rather than look in a demeaning way. Coming back to what we have been going through and what you might have looked at, obviously in the first session, we looked at the differentiation between different types of disabilities. We're talking approximately about 200 million persons around the world that suffer utter discrimination. And obviously, we hope that you be part of changing that reality, changing the exclusion under which they live. At the moment, this session, I'm sending live from Colombia. And I visited a school, Montessori school, that has children from the age of 3 until 18. And it was interesting because the legislation allows for curricular flexibility. And 14% of the students at this school, with over 300 students, have various mental conditions and syndromes, but are participating in the classes. However, they apply curricular flexibility, which means they are not imposing lectures and classes in topics for which any of those with various conditions are not in a position to really absorb. Why is this so important? Because very often when we talk about inclusion, what we actually do is we insert a student into a classroom, but we don't change the curriculum appropriately. So that is a very important issue that coming years will need to focus much more on. How can we apply curricular flexibility so that we can be inclusive, not just insert somebody, but actually to be inclusive. Now, having looked at these aspects and the type of discrimination and how do we view issues of inclusion, we looked at the various conditions, autism, cerebral palsy to some extent, and also microcephalia. In all of those, obviously there is a professional terminology and jargon that we use. However, it is very important that we use vis-a-vis the non-professionals, the parents of a child and so on, that we use a terminology that is accessible for them, but also a way of describing autism and other conditions in a way that can be more easily understood, and above all, that can generate a sense of empathy. I have used at times the example, for instance, those with cerebral palsy who have, you know, very high muscular tone, which keeps their arms and hands tight, or we have situations or where they have also spasms, very strong spasms, or low muscular tone, and their head kind of falls down. There are different situations that can occur. Now imagine if any of us were to live in such a body for 24 hours, how would we feel? And if on top of that, those looking at us view us as being a person that kind of is stupid, the way sometimes people look at persons with various conditions really reveals that type of attitude. That is a type of way of presenting that can help engender when you are talking to someone. You can try to generate a sense of empathy and understanding. They have an incredible patience with us typical persons with our often misplaced behavior. In Spanish, being often in Spanish environments and in Spanish-speaking countries, I have noted that we can sometimes see how they use enfermita or pobrecito. They use paternalistic terminology and also transmitting as if, you know, they had some type of disease. In Swahili and in French, in Arabic, it's very important again to review with the local population or those that are use that as mother tongue, what is the meaning, what is the sense that is being transmitted to the public in general with the terminology that is being used for various forms of disability. Turning a little bit to public policy, you might be over the years in different positions, management positions, whether in a hospital, whether in a private sector, business, or whatever. Very important when you try to work towards inclusiveness, to look at adapting everything from how your teams work to how you organize recruitment. You cannot do recruitment of persons living with conditions and syndromes in the same way that you would recruit other typical persons. So you have to define and work through how you would try to identify the skills that you are looking for. One of the best examples that I found about changing this, which I have mentioned in an earlier session, was La Casa de Carlota in Barcelona. their website, La Casa de Carlota. I think it's .org. Or it could be .com, but just Google La Casa de Carlota. And they have both in their website English and Spanish. But they completely adapted how they do the recruitment so that they would be able to recruit persons with autism, with cerebral palsy, or with Down syndrome. And we have in earlier sessions gone through what positive impact they had in the design work that they have been doing. But again, you as manager, in whatever function you will be involved in, you need to look at, if you really want your workplace to be inclusive, what do I need to do to change procedures that might generate an impediment for persons with various conditions and syndromes to join your teams, to be part of your workplace. So again, some of those reflections we have given as support documentation. If you're interested to go in and look, you can see links to various examples that might give you ideas on how to be more inclusive. I think I will take a little break there and see if Phyllis has some questions or some comments that have been made by the students. La Casa de Carlota was the website. I see somebody was asking that question. But Phyllis, go ahead, let me know if there are questions that have been raised so far.
There's one question, and it's: when appealing to our college administrations or company administrations to make space for people with various conditions, what should we ask for specifically?
That's a very good question. Well, firstly, I would like to use that excuse to elaborate a little bit on the 7th session that we had. In the 7th session, we went through in some greater detail about human rights instruments and the importance of the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. To read that convention does not take that long time, but if you want to argue in your workplace or wherever you want to work towards inclusiveness, then seek how to use the arguments that are given there. Obviously, there might be also state laws, and there might be municipal laws or county laws that establish certain parameters for inclusion. But from a starting point, it should be a fundamental rights issue that persons be given the opportunity to contribute in the workplace. Now, some say, oh, but that would be a costly issue. Well, not necessarily, because if you want your workplace to be inclusive, then you need to, you might want to attract customers, or you might have those coming to the hospital that live with condition. If you have somebody in the hospital with Down syndrome that can support some of your work, that creates, a completely different image for a family that comes with somebody with Down syndrome to the hospital. So you can use different arguments from simply humane human relations point of view, but also from attracting customers, making them feel welcome, and that this is an inclusive place, and all the way to human rights arguments and issues of inclusion. And then you might have laws in your country that establish certain fundamentals about inclusion. Regretfully, we have tons of laws and they are not always followed. So we need advocates like you to push the issues forward. Back to you, Phyllis. Let me check here in the chat.
Yes,
Yes.
I have a question. Apologies. I have a question regarding schooling. Would you say Montessori schools are best for persons with syndromes?
Well, the reason I went to visit the school was to see how it operates. I think the Montessori school uses a methodology that is very attuned or very helpful to persons with conditions and syndrome. It is fantastic for typical children because it allows them to develop various skills at their timing, at their own timing. In this school specifically that I visited, even small children that were 3-4 years old had trays that they were carrying with real porcelain, which meant that if it would fall, it would break. So they really took very good care at carrying. It helped their coordination, everything. And they would sit down to have their little cup of tea, and then they would wash it. So they would learn a number of things, everything from taking the break of having a little moment, sitting with a friend around the table, all the way to the organization of the work and then cleaning up after them. But children with conditions and syndromes melted very well into that type of environment. And they had the twinning process also of, you know, you are a friend with him, and that way they would always have a friend and be friends. Some of them were friends with many, of course, particularly those with Down syndrome. But I felt that Montessori was a very, very good school. And at the moment, with HDPI, we're trying to get in touch with the board of Montessori to see what more could be done to, so to speak, market the Montessori methodology to improve the development opportunities for children living with various conditions and syndromes. Any other comments or questions you would like to highlight, Phyllis?
I think that's it for the moment. Let's go ahead.
Excellent, thank you. Well, inclusion into the workplace was one of the areas that we looked into. However, not all can move into an organized work setting. Their conditions might be relatively severe, and therefore, what do we do in that type of opportunities? Or what do we do in that type of situation? I believe that in some of those circumstances, it might be very useful to have some type of daily activity center, but not a daily activity center that is like a warehousing or a little bit of entertainment. It really should be strongly focused on providing development opportunities. I know in the US that at the age of 21, that's the maximum that they can participate in high school. After that, there isn't much that is organized in an adequate way. Here, with lawyers, I would probably love to discuss how should we view persons with differing abilities, but with relatively severe conditions that make it more difficult to be fully functional. What do we do in that type of situations when they're intellectual age might be equivalent to 3, 4, 5 years of age, although their physical age might be 25, 30, 40, 50 years of age. Well, I think some type of day activities would be very important. Now, I gave the example in one of the sessions about Acudam, ACUDAM, in Spain, Mollerusa, a company created to employ persons with conditions. They actually have relatively severe persons with severe conditions working. So that's a workplace created specifically, but not in a subsidized way. It's fully financed by what they produce, but they are not looking at maximizing profits. What they are looking is maximize, obviously they need the profit to be able to function in the way they do, but they are seeking to maximize the development opportunities for those that are working there. So again, if we could, if we could create more opportunities, more work opportunities that can expand the type of severity of conditions that could benefit from the development provided by that workplace, that would be wonderful. But I don't think it will be fully done in the coming 10 years perhaps, and therefore we need to look at, can we expand daily developmental activities for all those that are older than 21 years of age, so that they can have a daily opportunity for development. I visited in the Caribbean some countries and territories where they don't provide that type of opportunities. And many of them have kind of fallen by the wayside into alcohol, into marijuana, into drugs. And basically, they are floating around without any meaningful engagement. And I think any of us, if we were in an environment where we are not being provided opportunities to develop and to engage in a meaningful way, it would gradually destroy our self-esteem and our capacity to learn new things. So I hope we can advocate day activity centers. At the moment, we're trying in Tanzania, in refugee camps there, with hundreds of thousands of refugees from Congo and Burundi, for them to start daily activity for those with conditions and syndromes, so that they are provided development opportunities. Now, a little bit, when talking about the areas of daily activities and work place, what are your opportunities to work internationally? Well, over the coming years, we will have huge challenges in improving the quality of life and the dignity of persons living with conditions and syndromes. One such area relates to refugees and internally displaced persons. We have approximately, at this moment, sorry, my throat is not working as it should. We have at the moment 70 million refugees and internally displaced persons worldwide. And the international community has assumed a particular responsibility to provide support, health, education, food, community development activities for persons that that are in that condition, either internally displaced or refugees. However, among them, we estimate approximately 1.5 million live with mental conditions and syndromes, and they are hidden away, very seldom seen. They seldom have access to vaccinations. They are very seldom taken to a clinic by their parents. Their teeth deteriorate horribly, their feet, nails, the nails in their hands and so on. No one is really caring for them. Really very, very difficult conditions under which they live. And above all, basically isolated, hidden away. And different non-governmental organizations, as well as UN agencies, such as the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, UNICEF, World Food Programme, but also the Red Cross movement and some of the large NGOs such as Oxfam, Save the Children, Plan International, just to mention a few. All of them in the coming years will need staff, for instance, with nursing knowledge, but that also have an idea of how to interact with persons living with conditions and syndrome, who can work with the communities to change their attitudes towards persons living with conditions and syndrome, who can help identify where they are and create daily activities in an organized way that can provide development opportunities, also to provide protection for them, because sometimes relatives end up chaining them. And I have found such cases. And therefore, having a daily activity center at a community center for them could provide better opportunities for them to be developed as a person, but also to protect them from violence, from sexual abuse, and so on. Talking about sexual abuse in these contexts is also extremely important, because for some, in some places, it's almost as if they look between their fingers that some of these girls with conditions are being abused. It's very often happening with someone close to the family. It's very seldom a stranger. It's very often a close relative. Again, those with a nursing background that have an understanding of these issues, that can engage in working with some of these international non-governmental organizations or even UN agencies, will help change over the coming 10 years how the situation is in terms of protection for persons living with conditions and syndromes. On 18 December 2020, which means basically 2 months ago, Special Olympics International signed an agreement with the UN High Commissioner for Refugees, where the UN High Commissioner for Refugees basically requests Special Olympics to train the UN staff working for them on how to interact with persons living with conditions and syndromes. And I'm part of a group where we are seeking to develop the curriculum of what is the type of knowledge we need at a headquarters level, at a regional office level, at a country office level, and down at a refugee camp. And obviously, we need many more hours once we reach a refugee camp level compared to what is needed at headquarters level. But still, we would like to reach all the way up to the High Commissioner and down. We would like all the staff to have much greater awareness about disabilities in general and about conditions and syndromes more particularly. Now I've taken an international perspective on this issue, but you can look at within your state where you are based, if it is Florida or if it is Tanzania or whatever. There is a need to generate greater knowledge within the Red Cross movement, within the local NGOs, and there are local NGOs that are doing great work, but might need support in terms of spreading the word, so to speak, in a greater way. So I think those are examples of areas where, with what you're learning as a nurse, you could do so much more than just being or working at a hospital. You could be part of changing attitudes around the world. My own youngest daughter, she has worked 7 years in South Sudan, in the Central African Republic, and in Congo. She's a nurse, but she has also studied political science, and she has been very much involved in protection of persons affected, civilian population affected by conflict. When I organized, this was an example of how somebody with a nursing background can work in very broad fields. Organized the repatriation of refugees from first Botswana and then from Zambia to what today is Zimbabwe in 1980. I actually recruited doctors and nurses to manage, for instance, a train convoy. We rented 11 wagons, a train that would go from the north of Zambia all the way to Bulawayo in Zimbabwe, with 1,000 students every once a week. And we had feeding stations along the way. But it was so much better to have medical doctors and nurses as the staff managing the entire logistics operation, because their nursing background, their health background gives them, you know, an organized mind, an organized way of doing things. And we transported 11,500 basically children and teenagers from the age of 5 all the way to 17 and 18. And we didn't have a single accident or incident. It was all excellently managed. And I think to a large extent, it was because we had staff with medical background involved in doing something that was broader than what they had studied, but they definitely had a capacity and a comparative advantage in working in that type of context. So I'm mentioning this because we need persons like the students of this course to be involved in different sectors of society, changing attitudes, changing foundations in how they think, changing how authorities view. And if it wasn't you that tried to influence, if it wasn't university students trying to push the envelope and the agenda, I don't think that many county authorities are very open to change, are very open to improve the situation for persons with conditions and syndromes. So I think you play a very important role in developing abilities, changing patterns of behavior, changing rules, improving the dignity with which persons with conditions and syndromes are treated. Before we move into the final part of the session, I wanted to check with with Phyllis, if there are any additional questions.
No, I don't. There are some very good comments there that you all may want to pay attention to, but they're not questions. So please go ahead.
Okay, I hope those good comments have been shared with everyone so that everyone can benefit. And I'm very, very happy to and thank all the students that contribute with ideas on how you can contribute in different ways so that all of us can learn in this type of context. Now, we have talked about various forms of inclusiveness that we need to attain. One of the more difficult parts that I find we're a bit challenged with is assisted living. I visited assisted living in many different countries, and obviously the quality varies a lot. But the fundamental part still remains on what can we do to have staff that is motivated in a positive way. Too many who work in group homes are trying to do a job because they feel they have to do it, but they don't show the level of empathy that would be needed. In the work we have been doing at the Foundation La Ventana de los Cielos in Homestead, we have worked a lot at trying to train the volunteers in a way that engenders not just an ability how to interact, but that also creates a sense where you transmit dignity to persons living with conditions and syndromes. And we do so obviously because it's not enough just to provide sort of entertainment or certain developmental activities. You also want to transmit dignity and dignify the lives of persons in the same way that you want others to treat you in a respectful way. You don't want a professor that treats you in a bad way or looks down at you, etc. You want an environment, you learn much better in an environment where you're respected and well treated. I noted, and perhaps I should double check here, but I think somebody was asking, there is a question here. Can you also talk about La Ventana and how persons can become involved prior to the session ending? Thank you for that question. Regretfully, since 16 March last year, we had to close physical activities. So what we have been doing is this type of online training, and we organize weekly Zoom sessions with the program participants. In fact, 1 hour after this session, we have the weekly session with the program participants with all their different conditions. So the possibility for becoming involved with physical activity, we haven't yet been able to restart. We're waiting that the dissemination of the vaccine in the coming weeks will enable us to reopen. Who knows, perhaps by May, we may be able to open. And then you have various possibilities. You can involve during the week when we have programs for those that are older with different conditions, or Saturdays when we have the general program, which covers all ages from about 1 year of age and no limit. On Saturdays, when we have general program activities, we have both music therapy and art and interaction with the animals, and we can go around the farm in order to have as much physical activity as possible. And some are involved in caring for the animals, others in cleaning the animal habitats. So we try to both provide developmental opportunities for, firstly, physical activities, secondly, for the cognitive development, thirdly, positive emotional engagement, fourth, psychosocial contact. they really need to be able to interact with others. And many of them, once you get involved, will say, can I have your Facebook? Can I be your friend in Facebook? Others are completely nonverbal. So you have to communicate in a different way with them. With those with cerebral palsy, just very simple measures like while you're talking and walking with them, just helping them open up their hands who might be completely tightly not up like this. If you can just help them stretch out, you don't need to have a degree in physiotherapy to do simple measures like that, but that helps them relax their muscles, but it also helps their parents or caretakers to realize that they can't just leave them 7 days a week all bundled up like this. They need to be provided opportunities. Obviously, there is need for appropriate physiotherapy, but they might only be able to be there an hour or 2 hours a week, but you might be able to at least help in the environment where they are, show them that by doing something like that, they can help relax. I remember both Nando and Fernando, both with cerebral palsy, after an hour of just doing simple exercises like that, they come out much more relaxed and really enjoying, you know, seeing how their hand has changed and become proud of that. And particularly for someone like Nando, it helps him typing. He likes writing books, and it makes it easier for him to type. Other organizations, I see somebody mentions Best Buddies. Best Buddies is like a almost twin organization of Special Olympics. Special Olympics was started by Eunice Shriver, the sister of John F. Kennedy. They had a sister living with a condition, Rosemary, and that drove Eunice to try to create better opportunities for persons living with conditions and syndromes. And sports is a very effective way of changing the attitude of typical persons. Because when typical persons see how well somebody with a condition can develop when involved in sports, it really makes a huge difference. So Best Buddies seeks to twin, was started by one of the sons of Eunice Shriver. Tim Shriver is the president of Special Olympics International. And Anthony was the one that started Best Buddies. Again, organizations that seek to dignify persons. Unified sports is something that Special Olympics has been seeking to promote in the past years. And I myself been playing in soccer games where you have persons with autism and Down syndrome and typical person. And it's so fun because it brings you back to the essence of sports. The essence being having an enjoyable time together and enjoying how we can do things with each other. So again, sports is another way of organizing developmental opportunities anywhere in the world. You can do it in Tanzania, you can do it in Kenya, in the US, in Sweden, whatever. Assisted living was where I started, and I don't want to focus too much on the negatives, but I want to remind us before we close that in the Western world, we have tended to over-medicalize. We tend to sometimes give too quickly an injection when somebody has a tantrum instead of sitting down with them for half an hour. And it's very important that we keep that in mind. Use as little medication as possible. I cannot overcome how I think it's in Cutler Bay, in a group home where Nando is living. Somehow his psychiatrist claimed 2 years ago that he was suicidal. Nando can't understand how his psychiatrist could come to that conclusion, but he then prescribed a very type of strong sedation treatment. And he tries sometimes to convince the staff at the group home not to force him to take these drugs in the morning so that he can think, because he says, I can't even think. It's very difficult for me to write and other things that he wants to do because he becomes too sedated. So whatever you can do and contribute to more of human interaction and less of strong dosage that sedates, the better. I can understand, I have seen it sometimes. You can have a person with a condition that has a peak of bad behavior, but try as much as possible to see how you can be a good fellow human being to him, and train staff on how to be a good human person to this individual, so that they don't need to be sedated weeks on end. In the same way, in countries of the South, please try to find out where are the persons living with conditions and syndromes. Clovis is a friend who lives in Burundi. And he told me when we organized sports activities in the heart of Burundi in both November 2019 and in November 2020, that he discovered suddenly so many families, including his neighbor, who had 3 now adult children with conditions, and he didn't know. He had never seen them. But he also was able to transmit the tears in the eyes of the mothers when coming out to these sports activities, surrounded by hundreds of people watching at them, all with covers, but still they were able to do sports activities, and the mothers were crying of joy seeing how happy their children were. And I'm talking about children with perhaps 25, 35, 45 years of age. So again, whether in countries of North or countries of South, let's look out for persons with conditions. What are the possibilities of interacting with a group home, with assisted living places? And let's see how one can motivate the staff to really do their work in a dignified way, in a way that dignifies those with conditions and syndromes. I think that will be the end. I will hand over to Phyllis and to Linda for some final points, but I would like to thank all of you. What drives me, what drives La Ventana, what drives Special Olympics is to change the world so that we discriminate less against persons living with conditions and syndromes. And I strongly believe that all of you who have participated in the course have in it to be part of changing the world. Thank you so much.